Hello, everyone. Before we get started with today's webinar, just a quick housekeeping item to address. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, if you utilize the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, we'll ensure that the questions are addressed at the end. Any questions that we're unable to get to, we of course will follow up with you with a response. With that, please go to the next slide. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar on the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR as it's commonly known. This is the third GDPR webinar in a series. Next slide, please. Actually, that's not quite the one I was expecting, but I can speak to that. Please join us next month on December 13th. We will continue the series with a special guest, Vidyard, and we'll discuss how video can be utilized in this post-GDPR world to keep your prospects and customers engaged in content as well. With that, we've titled this particular webinar, Eloqua GDPR Success, the Future of B2B Marketing in a GDPR World. And over the next 60 minutes, we'll be discussing new B2B marketing strategies adapted for a GDPR world, how to educate your audience with multiple pieces of content without catching and releasing their attention repeatedly, how to transform your one and done buyer's journey into a binge-worthy series of content. As way of introduction, my name is Al Arceo. I'm a strategic account director at 4Thought Marketing and lead our sales efforts in the Western United States. As many of you know, 4Thought Marketing is an Oracle Eloqua Gold partner, and we've been part of the Eloqua ecosystem for about 10 years. We also have two special guests on the webinar today. I'd like to introduce Mark Lavelle, co-founder and president of 4Thought Marketing. Mark has close to 30 years of CRM and marketing automation experience. Prior to founding 4Thought Marketing, Mark held leadership positions at Market to Lead, Market First, and Pivotal. Mark, please say hello.
Good morning or afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. Excited to be here today. Great,
thank you. In addition, we also would like to introduce Chris Vandermeerel, Director of Demand Generation at Path Factory. In his role at Path Factory, Chris is often called upon to go deep in the marketing tech stack to help solve the tough real-world challenges that sales and marketing professionals face every day. If you're the kind of marketer who obsesses over A/B tests, loves digging into data to prove a hypothesis, or believes that no idea is too out there to try at least once, Chris will be your new BFF. Go ahead and say hello, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here today, and hopefully you find our content insightful.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. Well, there's the webinar item that I was expecting before, but let's go ahead and move to the next slide. All right, just a little bit about 4Thought Marketing. As I mentioned before, we've been part of the ecosystem for well over 10 years. We offer a number of services. The services that we'll be covering today, at least indirectly, will be 4Comply, our compliance cloud apps, as well as our consulting services. So after the webinar, if you'd like more information regarding any of our services or the 4Comply products, please feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to answer any questions. And with that, let's go ahead and transition to some content. Mark, why don't you go ahead and kick things off?
Thank you very much, Al. Greatly appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. Really appreciate the honor of being able to speak with you today. So today's session is GDPR Eloqua Success. It's the number 3 in a series that we've been conducting on GDPR Success. This is Adapt or Get Left Behind. Before we get started, just a touch more housekeeping, and this will be the end of it, I believe. We are not attorneys. I think everybody knows that, but we have to say it nonetheless. So although we are talking about regulations today, if there are any questions that are of a legal nature, legal conclusion, you should of course consult your attorney on that. Now, one of the things we like to kick these presentations off with is the latest in the news. I'd like to run through a couple things really quick. Since May 25th, when GDPR went into effect, a number of things have been occurring, and in the last 3 months especially. In France, we have had actual two particular supervisory authority issues come into play. Both two small companies, important to note, not large ones, were I don't know what the proper term is, but talked to by the DPA of France. The good news is that in both of these cases, when the organization changed, there was no fines because they worked with the regulators, because they ended up complying with the regulators. They did avoid a fine. Interesting thing here is that these companies were vendors to other companies. In Brazil, we have a new general data protection regulation. It's actually passed back in July, but it's not commonly known, signed into law on August 14th. In the United States, we have the California Consumer Privacy Act. Most people have heard about this, especially in the United States. But what you may not know is that in the Congress and in the Senate, there's a lot of conversation right now about data privacy legislation occurring on a national basis. From a fines perspective, the EU privacy chief is expecting a number of rounds of fines coming in under the new law by year end. This is October 9th data, relatively new. And from a complaints perspective, there's a large number of complaints that have been coming in across the EU. The bottom line here from a news perspective or a summary perspective is that GDPR is real and it is progressing. It is not, sort of going away as many folks hoped. It is maturing into something that is being enforced and obviously will continue to be enforced. I think the data privacy authorities are right now, so far, being considerate of the fact that it's a new law, but that will not continue forever. And we're getting warning signs that it won't continue forever. Now, from a webinar perspective, this is number 3 in our series, Adapt or Get Left Behind.
Mark, before you proceed, we just got a request from one of the attendees indicating that they can't quite hear you. I'm wondering if you can speak up just a bit.
Is that any better?
Much better. Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies. If my voice should drop again, Al, please let me know. So we are in number 3 in a series here. We have conducted or been through number 1 in the series, which was exactly how to implement GDPR and Eloqua. Number 2 was lessons learned, and we have another one, as Al mentioned, coming up in November, I think it is. Number 4 with partner Vidyard. Now, there are basically 2 hurdles that we need to cross in regards to GDPR. And these 2 hurdles are not insignificant. The first is the one that most people have been focusing on and being aware of, and that is complying with the law. And this is what our first particular webinar focused on. We talked about specifically what data controllers need to do, but that really wasn't the focus of the presentation. The focus of the presentation is what the Eloqua users need to do and about the various rights that need to be implemented and the proof that needs to occur in the event that, that you're audited or pursued. We also went through in that original presentation a total of 8 different use cases, including how you handle the right to access and change, and how you handle the right to portability, and how you even import a list and send a list and do reporting. We created flows. This particular one on screen is one of several. Number 5 of all of them. And those flows helped a lot of our customers really cross that first hurdle. The question now is, and in addition to that, we talked about 7 different cloud apps that 4Thought Marketing provides, and how those cloud apps can specifically help. So that really crossed the first hurdle, or helped us cross the first hurdle. Then after we got past May 25th, we learned a lot of different lessons. The main lessons that we focused on our last webinar are in this first 3 area, but we just went through a ton of growth between January and our August or September webinar it was. Now, those got us over the first hurdle, and that's the great news that implementation of GDPR was successful for many of our customers. But that left the second hurdle. And the second hurdle, in many ways, is the bigger hurdle. And from a marketing perspective and a sales perspective, the more important hurdle, because nobody makes any money from complying with the law. They make money from marketing. So the second hurdle is, how do we successfully market despite GDPR? How do we get across and do what we used to do, or at least achieve results like what we used to achieve, but in this new world? And at first, this new hurdle looks more like a wall. Why does it look like a wall? Well, let's say you have 100,000 suspects, or let's say you have 1 to 3 million suspects, but a bunch of those haven't opted in. Or perhaps you have a checkbox, but the checkbox was previously checked, so they haven't properly opted in. Excuse me, my slide progressed forward accidentally. So they haven't properly opted in. What that means is you cannot market to that group. And that's a huge problem for many of our customers, has been a real challenge. In addition, from a list perspective, you get these lists, you get them from 3 different sources. You get them from partners, you get them from vendors where you buy them, you get them from trade shows. And unless the partner or the vendor or the trade show vendor has had their own consent box that has been properly enabled so that it's not proactive, and your company name is specifically listed in the privacy policy, then you can't import those lists and use those lists. You have no, what's called under GDPR, a basis for processing, and that's a huge problem as well. Again, it looks more like a wall. Then number 3, you can no longer trade contents for assets. Quid pro quo, that's what that says down there, honest, is no longer acceptable. And this is, again, a huge problem for us as marketers, because we're used to coming up with an asset and saying, hey, here is an asset that you're really going to like. This is a high value asset, and we will trade it to you if you give us marketing consent. That now is illegal. You cannot trade a Starbucks card. You cannot trade a contest entry. All consent under GDPR must be freely given. If you want to give them something else and encourage them to, give marketing consent if they want to, you can, but you cannot require it. So trading consent is off the table. Importing lists can be off the table. Your existing database can be off the table. Holy smokes, do we have a problem here? Now, in truth, it's not completely as bad as this, because you may have some folks that have opted in. Your vendors are probably starting to get your company name in the lists of your trade shows and in the privacy policies, so you can bring those lists in. And you can't really trade consent for assets, but you can. There are some tricks here we're going to talk about. So what I want to talk about now is, from a marketing perspective in the past, we have always had the concept of general nurturing. Somebody comes to our website and we take them through a series of asset steps. Each of these particular asset steps teach them something about our product, and maybe it even provides different products, and which product they click on might take them down to a nurture, something like that. A more narrow form of nurturing and marketing is product nurturing, and this is very similar to general nurturing, but instead of taking them through all of our general nurturing, we're taking them through a specific series of communications about a particular product. So the thing about these two is that when somebody comes to your website, and fills out a form, if they don't give you marketing consent, these are kind of against the rules. Now, there's a little bit of a potential exception on product nurturing, which I'll talk about in a second. But without marketing consent, you just can't send them things sort of randomly that you think they would be interested in. What you do have, and in fact, and the reason for this is historical. We all have had huge inbox issues over the years. We know our customers have them too. And this is because underlying and really the genesis of GDPR is trust. We as marketers, and I'm not speaking to anybody specifically here, but the marketing community has to some extent abused trust. And some of this is because of there's also some horrible bad actors out there, but there are, in addition, the general marketplace has abused the trust. And so this is resulting in situations today where you might say something that is perfectly reasonable and rational, like, yes, I'd like to hear more about your products and services. But when a company is first encountered by a prospect, when your company is first encountered by a customer, by a prospect or a suspect, they don't have trust. And without trust, what they hear is something along the lines of, yes, send me items unrelated to my specific interest, research me, and stalk me for the next 5 years. And this is what's left us with an inability to do that general nurturing that we used to do under GDPR without marketing consent. And so people, are reluctant to give consent And so getting marketing consent is challenging, and under GDPR, marketing without consent is challenging. So we can improve this. We can say something better than we're just going to send you products and services. We can take a step up. We can say, yes, I'd like to hear more about the Schlaffer Shifter 3000. And now what we're doing is we're getting into and successfully enabling product nurturing. Now, somebody is more likely to check on this. Why? Because assuming they are interested in the Schlaffer Shifter 3000, okay, they're saying, oh, these guys aren't telling me they're going to send me anything and everything. They're telling me they're going to send me information about the product I'm specifically interested in. So that's better. So now we can do some product nurturing. They still hear without trust. So now it's a little better, still not great, but it's now, yes, send me emails related to the specific product I've asked about. Yeah, I know you might research me and stalk me for the next 5 years. Now, but if you don't get consent, you have to do something else. There are basically, and people who have attended our previous webinars or know GDPR understand that there are 6 legal bases for processing under GDPR. And there are only 3 that matter to marketers. And if you're not focusing on customers, there's only 2 that matter. Marketing consent, marketing consent and legitimate interest. Now, if you don't get marketing consent, all you have left is legitimate interest. And legitimate interest is much more narrow than general nurturing. It's more narrow than product nurturing. Legitimate interest is the legal ability the legitimate ability to fulfill exactly what they've requested. You have a legitimate interest if a customer comes to a website and says, yes, give me this thing. You have the legitimate interest basis of processing to send them that thing. So you can send them just what they've requested. Now let's take a look at this legitimate interest, and especially this word requested. Just what they've requested. What can we do with that? Now, historically, we have sent, in terms of just what they've requested, an asset, a specific asset. You want an asset? Here's an asset. And then we've sent them everything else for the next 2 years, right? But we can't do that anymore. So instead of changing what we send them, automatically, maybe we can change what we request of them. Maybe we can use different words to instead of sending them a single asset, send them something that clearly conveys it's a multi-asset campaign. The point is we want to stop pushing assets and we want to start pushing a concept that lets you send, gives you legitimate legal interest to send several of them. So how do we do this? Well, it doesn't matter what you call a multi-asset campaign from a legal perspective, but it does matter from a marketing perspective. So we want to get people intrigued and interested. We've all had those pop-ups on our website that says, please sign up for our email program, please sign up. Those are annoying as heck, right? So we don't want to do that. So we want to get more narrow, but we still want to permit and get permission to conduct a series, send a group, send an ongoing stream of assets. So we can turn something like sending a white paper to please sign up for our white paper series on a specific subject. Or instead of signing up for a video, sign up for our quarterly video updates on GDPR or something you're specifically interested in. Instead of an article, maybe a monthly column or a content course or a 5 webinar series. Now these numbers in here, I particularly like them because they set expectations. They specifically say, okay, if I sign up with these guys, I'm going to get 3 of something, or I'm going to get 4 of something. And they know you're not going to send them stuff for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and they are more likely to say yes. So the idea is to switch from the old to the new, to stop doing single shots and start sending multi-asset campaigns. Push a concept that lets you send several of them. As marketers, you have to come up with the name of the concept. You have to make it interesting. You're probably going to A/B test a couple of these to find out which works. But the beauty of it is when you're done, when they make that request, you can send them all of what you said based on legitimate interest and without consent. And so now we have a point where we can take this legitimate interest and we can turn what used to be just an asset into a series of communications. And of course, when we have a series of communications instead of one, we have more opportunities for MQLs, we have more opportunities for conversions, we have more opportunities for consent. So this is a great step forward. We're not selling assets. We're not pushing assets anymore. We're pushing streams of communication. We're pushing a webinar series. You're in the middle of one of those right now. You're pushing a white paper series. You're pushing a concept that they want to get more information on, and it's going to come several times. Now, this is a great step in the right direction, but there's still an underlying problem. And that problem is, how do you break out of the specific legitimate interest area that they have talked about? How do you go farther? How do you get back to product nurturing? How do you get back to general nurturing? And the answer there is we're going to come to in just a second. But before we do, we're going to ask you a quick survey. Going to conduct a quick survey. That survey is, and Al, if you could pop that up for us, that'd be great. Which have you created the most of during the last quarter? Now, the first option here is single shot, non-interactive assets. When I say non-interactive assets, I mean assets that generally don't have clear, significant ability to go to lots of other assets. I'm not talking about a 2 or 3 links in a white paper. That would be considered a single shot number 1 asset. Option number 2 is interactive assets. These are assets which interact and access and work with a bunch of other assets. The third option is multi-part campaigns, which is what we've just been talking about for the last 6 or 7 minutes. And number 4 is campaigns that are both interactive and multi-part. So if we can go ahead and get some answers there. Al, I'm going to let you tell me when it looks like we have the right number of answers and should come back to this. And let's see here. I'm looking at I'm trying to pop up a poll here.
So we've got some pretty good responses here, and if the trend holds true, it looks like approximately 40% of the folks that have responded to this survey are indicating single shot non-interactive assets have been deployed. It's a bit of a tie at 26% between interactive assets with the ability to access many other assets, as well as multi-part campaigns. And the last option, we only got a 5% response.
And that's pretty common and pretty consistent with what we've been seeing in the industry and, well, why we're making these points. So I'd like to kind of continue on here. And thank you, Al, for that. So we have seen single asset campaigns, which we've been talking about, turn into multi-part campaigns. We have seen a situation here where folks are moving this direction, and that 40% over here and that 26% over here is sort of an indication of where we are in the industry. Now, again, the value of multi-part campaigns is legitimate interest. Again, the legal reason you can send something to somebody is received if you position it right, if you present it right, as I talked about earlier, for a multi-part campaign. And then nurturing is permissible without consent. In other words, if they go to the form, they fill it out, they don't check off marketing consent, you can still nurture them for the 3-part series or the 4-part webinar or the educational event that consists of multiple sessions. And of course, more assets, more opportunities for consent conversion, like I said before. Now, I'm going to add to this concept. Now, actually, well, anyway, and again, multi-part campaigns circumvent GDPR consent. We still have the problem, though. How do you break out of just that particular concept? And the answer here is the ability to get into complex assets versus simple assets. Now, I don't want to steal any of Chris's thunder. He's going to be talking more about what we call complex assets in just a few minutes. But I will say real quickly, why complex assets? Well, complex assets interact. They're highly personalized. They give people choice. And the beauty of them is that they enable cross-consumption without consent. In other words, they allow you to break out of that inner arrow into the other products and services that your organization sells. Again, it also means that customers can binge, you get pull instead of push marketing. And so if we combine these two, we really get the strength here. And if I take this and I put this on a different sort of dimension, if I take one of these and I turn it vertical, we end up with sort of a quadrant. And the real final sort of end game for these two tactics is to accomplish both. The percentage that you said today is 5%, Al. Well, that's where we want to go. We want to have multi-part campaigns and complex assets. When we combine the two of those, then we get the successful hurdling of that second hurdle, and maybe even the winning of the race, whatever that means to your particular situation. So folks, that's it for me today. To summarize, complex assets and multi-part campaigns together are today's tricks for marketing despite GDPR and clearing that second hurdle. These techniques work, and what's great about them is that they're right in line with what we know is optimal marketing, empowering the customer to access SPOR assets flexibly, truthfulness in what we're going to send them, and improving their customer experience. Al, I'm sorry, any questions, anybody?
Mark, there was a question that was submitted here in the last few minutes. In terms of CASL, this is basically implied consent, something that's relatable. Can you perhaps speak to the differences between implied consent under CASL versus GDPR?
Sure. So the primary difference, first of all, CASL and GDPR are very different. Under CASL, you have very defined times to live for records. Under situation A, it's 2 years, and situation B, it's 3 years. I'm not going to try and teach CASL right now. And it's an interestingly timed question, because we this week are actually implementing a version of 4Comply that will implement GDPR and CASL at the same time. So from an implied consent perspective, in both situations, you have to proactively check off the checkbox. But the beauty of CASL is it really focuses on email, not the basis of processing. Under GDPR, you can't even process somebody's record without that consent. This basically means that you can't store the information, you can't move the information, you can't calculate the information. Under CASL, you can process that information. So you can have it in your database, you can store history on it, but you can't email them. I will mention, though, that Canada is looking at potentially tightening up their regulations. GDPR does seem to be leading the world. And I see one other question here, too. I'll answer it real quick, and then Al, back to you. So someone is saying here, if you collect a business card at an event and you send a follow-up communication with one asset that a month later, you're not really permitted to send another communication on the same similar topic. So when you collect a business card, you're doing so with an intent to respond or come back to that customer. When I usually get this question, and there's no context, oh, there is context here. It says at an event. So if you are at a trade show and you get a business card, you would have a legitimate interest basis for processing to send them a response to the fact that they visited your trade show booth. But you would not have marketing consent because they did not clearly and unambiguously check a checkbox that says, yes, please send me stuff. Collecting business cards in a fishbowl that has a sign over it is not clear enough because there's not a proactive action that they have to check off being taken. Now, if someone wrote marketing consent on the back of the business card, that would probably be good enough. If you handed them an iPad and the iPad had a, obviously a checkbox and the appropriate wording on it, that would be good enough. But if you just get a business card at a trade show, typically it would be appropriate for you to respond to them, thank them for visiting the trade show, fulfill any specific literature requests that they had, and you would not have ongoing marketing consent. I hope that answers your question, Cheryl. And Al, with that, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you, Mark. If you go ahead and unshare your slides, we can let Chris share his. All right, Chris, you're all set. Take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Al. Thank you, Mark, for that kind of first bit. And it's exactly what we have focused on at Path Factory as far as what does marketing look like in a GDPR world. And I want to walk you through some of that from our perspective. But just to begin, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. So I am the Director of Demand Generation at Path Factory. Some fun facts about me: I'm a career marketer and I come from a strong marketing ops background. So I've spent lots of time in Marketo and Eloqua and do understand the ins and outs and constraints that modern marketers face today. I'm a father of one with 2 on the way. So needless to say, I'm very busy. I'm a lover of all things food and wine, definitely a passion of mine, as well as the Toronto Maple Leafs, who have gotten off to quite a good start this season, although it's starting to look a bit shaky now. So yeah, we'll see how the rest of the season pans out. Now, you may not have heard of Path Factory before. We've been around for about 5 years now and have progressed a lot in that time. But if you've used Eloqua or B2B Marketer, we're very relevant to you and exist in a space that you'd be familiar with. We have customers like GE, IBM, SAP, ADP, Cisco, all using the Path Factory platform and using it in conjunction with popular marketing automation platforms like Eloqua, Marketo, Pardot, etc. And as an organization, we are really focused on creating better experiences for your buyers, improving your conversion rates, and ultimately optimizing all of your spend and performance across your entire marketing organization. So I really wanted to start today with looking at what has really happened, the progression of GDPR, a lot like Mark discussed at the beginning. When GDPR was kind of looming, was coming around at the beginning of this year, and that firm deadline was on everybody's horizons, you're seeing headlines that looked like this. It's the big, scary, bad GDPR monster that was coming to get everybody. There was fears of fines. There was a lot of talk of compliance, all the things that you needed to do to be compliant. People were definitely afraid of having their hands slapped or worse and getting caught by not following the procedures that they needed to. So as a result, we ended up generally seeing two major things happen with B2B marketing organizations. The first one, like Mark mentioned, is keeping your forms unchecked from consent by default. So you saw checkboxes that were blank, and then you had to check them off to receive more information and opt in to future communications. And every time you hit somebody's website, you were presented with a pesky pop-up that looks something like this. Continue and accept cookies. You could either accept or reject them, was definitely best practice. And so you saw marketers reacting by doing these things, plus a bunch of other things behind the scenes to make sure that data was processed appropriately. And that was really the hurdle that people were trying to get over by May, by the time this actually took effect. But what we're here to talk about today is what B2B marketers need to be doing going forward to actually be effective marketers today. Leaving the compliance aside, what are the next things that we need to do? And what I wanted to do is take a step back and think about what is it fundamentally that B2B marketers are trying to do? What are we actually trying to solve for? And this is what I think of as somebody in demand generation myself. It's preparing leads for and accelerating them through a buying process. Fundamentally, what we're trying to do is actually provide our buyers with all the information that they need in order to progress forward. Whether that's very top of the funnel, thought leadership, just getting them introduced to who we are and what we do, all the way down to that bottom of funnel content that they need in order to really progress forward with a sale. When we look at how this actually plays out when our buyers are interviewed, they tell us that it's somewhere around 8 to 10 pieces of content that they want to see before they're ready to make a purchasing decision. More than ever before, buyers are expecting to get information on their terms when they want it, and they want every bit of information that they need before they buy. So Google here says 10.4 pieces of content. You can look to other studies. They're usually at least 8, sometimes greater than 10 pieces of content that a B2B buyer wants to see. So let's just step back for a moment and put ourselves in the shoes of our B2B buyers. Let's actually personify them. Let's give them a name. Let's call this person Steve. Now, Steve is your buyer. And if we think about how Steve actually walks through those 8 to 10 pieces of content today, it might look something like this. Steve walks in a door, maybe lands on your website initially. Very similar scenario to what Mark outlined earlier. Lands on your website and he wants to see an analyst report. So maybe you have him fill out a form. Hopefully he clicks the consent button at that time, and hopefully he opts into your cookies as well. Let's just assume that he does, and lands on that analyst report. Now, lucky for you, you have consent and you can actually send him an email, and maybe you present an offer to an ebook. Now, you've maybe placed a retargeting cookie on his computer because he opted into your cookies. He hit the accept button when he was on your website. So maybe you retargeted him with a display ad and he clicked through on your video. Then maybe you've also targeted him using social media. You've got a paid social campaign running against him that takes him to the blog post. And of course, you keep those emails going because it's a nurture sequence. So maybe you send him an email and he clicks through on a white paper. Now, I've just shown you him walking through 5 pieces of content just for argument's sake. But here's the problem in a GDPR world. These traditional techniques and tactics are completely crippled as a result of the regulations that we need to comply with as B2B marketers. So when you step back and think about it, let's say he didn't check off that checkbox on the form, and now all of a sudden you can't email him anymore. So those touches are gone. And maybe he clicked the reject button on the cookie consent form on your website. Well, now you can't actually retarget him. So how are you going to get him through those 8 to 10 pieces of content? How are you actually going to let him walk through his journey efficiently? Well, this is the way that we think about it. This is how things should really look in a GDPR world. Steve lands on your website, clicks through on that analyst report, but while you have that moment of attention, allow him to accelerate through and move on to the next piece, and the next, and the next. Why not in session, while he's browsing the content, allow him to move through that sequence? And just like Mark talked about, this works beautifully if you have sequenced content that is all related together, related to the same topic. But even if you don't, it makes sense to allow him to get to that next piece he needs, instead of relying on the traditional tactics and solely relying on things like retargeting and email nurture, these tactics that were already actually quite costly and time-consuming. Now we can actually move Steve through this journey more efficiently. And this is really the way B2B marketing will progress in a GDPR world. Now, it just so happens that somebody like Steve actually lives in an active content world. He's a subscriber to Spotify, he's on Netflix, he's an Amazon Prime member. He is used to on-demand, uninterrupted sequences of content. So you're not going to find him receiving paper copies of the newspaper to his door. Of course, he's on online newspapers. He's not a subscriber to cable TV, but he definitely is on YouTube browsing all of his favorite clips. And if you've not watched the Paul McCartney, James Corden carpool karaoke video, I highly recommend it. Highlight of 2018 for me, for sure. You're not going to find him in the empty shopping malls of America. Those are all shutting down, becoming obsolete because people are ordering things online and they're preferring services like Amazon. And you won't find him in a Blockbuster store. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 left in Alaska. People aren't renting movies at stores anymore. They're used to on-demand experiences like Netflix. Now, if you step back and think about what all of these have in common, they actually all produce those uninterrupted sequences of content in session. So looking at the New York Times, when somebody is reading an initial article, the New York Times presents related assets for them to move on to next, related articles. While you're watching that video of carpool karaoke, you can see all of those things that are up next, all of the videos you still need to watch. While you're on Amazon researching that children's car seat, here's all the related products that you're going to want to add to your cart, because people actually added those to their cart and purchased them in conjunction with this item. Amazon has the data to know that. And Netflix actually has a sophisticated algorithm that determines, based on the movie that you just consumed, what you need to consume next in session. So right when your movie's done, you have the recommendations popping up next. Now, this has actually been really beautifully outlined by Forrester in a new piece of research called The Birth of the B2B Consumer. And if you want to read that, we've licensed a copy. You can pop onto our website and get access to that. It's sitting on our homepage. But the gist of it, the details of it, is outlining how the traditional B2B consumer, who really relied on salespeople to give them their education and was fine with having a lot of gates and barriers in their way to getting the information they need, has merged with the modern B2B consumer, who's used to ordering Uber rides and is used to Netflix and Spotify. The two ideas have actually merged because these people are exactly the same. People's personal lives end up being pretty similar to their business lives. And there is a new B2B consumer out there that are expecting these uninterrupted sequences of content. And B2B buyers need to adapt or be left behind. That is what the report says. That's how it outlines this. So we really feel that it's time that we embrace customer centricity. We need to do this to accommodate our buyers, and we need to do this in a GDPR world because it's the only way that we can actually get people through the content that they need. Now I want to show you what this practically looks like. So if we think back to the example of somebody like Steve who wants to get access to that uninterrupted sequence of content, and let's say that we do have his consent to email him, and let's put yourself in the shoes of somebody named Marty. Marty's sending out his marketing emails from his company, Smart Desk AI. So he's sending these emails out of Eloqua, and when Steve clicks through, the solution is to send him to a smarter experience. So what we're typically doing today, the status quo approach, is a one-to-one click-to-content ratio. And what that means is on that one click that we generated, we're only sending Steve to one piece of content. And this is not terribly GDPR friendly, again, because it's going to be difficult to regain Steve's attention to get him through the next piece of content. But when we look at the scenario on the right, we're talking about a one-to-many click-to-content ratio. So every click that we generate means that somebody can consume multiple pieces of content. And you can see how this is animated here. As somebody is browsing that initial piece of content that was promised, that initial Forrester report or case study, they can click through right to the next piece of content very seamlessly and easily. And they can move through that journey on their own terms. And this is a really great way to package up the content sequences that Mark spoke about before. So if you have a webinar series and somebody's registering for the latest one, you could package up all the recordings that you previously recorded that they should see, or a white paper series. You have part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just run them down an index on the sidebar so that somebody can easily flip between the different pieces of content. This puts the buyer back in control. And as B2B marketers, we really need to let go of the control and expectation that the sequence of content can only be dictated on our terms. Now, if we think about how this actually gets presented practically, because this gets presented inside of an experience, inside of a track, we can also easily provide another opportunity for people to consent and opt into your cookies outside of just your website. So if you see a content track like this and a sequence of content, we found that it's very smart to actually collect people's consent while content is actually being viewed on demand. We make that very easy to do. So as somebody's actually learning more and reading more about you, you can actually try to get this consent in that moment and allow them to understand more about you before they opt in. It's very easy to do inside of the Path Factory platform. So we have all kinds of features that we've built. We have many customers that have strict GDPR compliance regulations. So it's very easy to pop this up for particular geographies or control which cookies do and do not get collected based on somebody declining or accepting the cookie consent dialog box that's popped up. And we really feel that we should understand more as B2B buyers. Now, if you think back to the example that was shown earlier, the Netflix and YouTube examples, the reason why they know exactly what you need to see next is because they collect a tremendous amount of data and they are very good at breaking it down and understanding what you consumed in the past. So Netflix knows exactly the movies that I'm going to like based on my content consumption history. And in the same way, YouTube will be doing the same thing, Amazon's doing the same thing, Spotify's doing the same thing. It's not good enough just to know that you clicked on an item, but it's actually understanding the consumption of that item. And so if we think about somebody like Steve, as B2B marketers, there's no excuse. We should know exactly what the content he consumed was about, whether he found it useful, and did this actually progress him forward in his buying experience. But unfortunately, the data that we actually practically collect, what we're collecting in Eloqua today, is things like the title of the asset, what the asset type was, whether somebody clicked through, filled out a form, downloaded, or visited our content. But we don't actually know whether they consumed it. Once they click through to that PDF or that video or that web page, we really only know that they got there or not, but we don't know if they spent 2 seconds, 2 minutes, 20 minutes, or 2 hours. We can't differentiate that data using existing technology. And that's really the other half of how we solve for this at PathFactory. If you have a look here, you can understand that somebody like Skeffington on the top row spent 2 seconds on a piece of content, whereas somebody like Sally spent well in excess of 30 minutes consuming 5 different unique assets. And this is the data set that we collect, and we make that available inside of Eloqua. So how PathFactory and Eloqua fit together starts with PathFactory, and that is we nurture prospects on demand with every click to content. So across every click that you generate as a B2B marketer, whether that's a click from your website, a click from an Eloqua email, from a display advertisement, from a social media post, all of your content can be served up in an uninterrupted on-demand sequence of content. We capture the real time spent on content so that you can understand whether it was actually consumed or whether somebody just bounced. And you can understand exactly what your content is about. You can understand what the topic areas of your white papers and ebooks actually were and how they're related together. And in Eloqua, you can point all of your clicks to much smarter content tracks. So instead of going to a dead-end experience where somebody ends up on a single document, you can actually empower them to get through more content in a single session. And you can understand in Eloqua the real time spent on content and store that inside of a custom data object. A lot of our customers are doing using this unique data set is much smarter lead scoring, alerts, segmentation, and making the data set available within Profiler. So in that way, the sales team can actually see down to the second who has spent time with which content assets. Gone are the days where you alert the sales team that somebody accessed an ebook. What we're really focused on is telling the sales team the difference between somebody who spent 5 seconds on the ebook and somebody who spent 5 minutes on the ebook. So we feel fundamentally that the one key change that needs to happen in a GDPR world is that we need to move towards an on-demand sequence of content. We need to put things back in the hands of the buyers and recognize that they're in control. The law is now regulating that, and we need to progress forward as B2B marketers. So that's it from the PathFactory side of things. I'm going to flip things back over to Mark and Al to close it out.
Thank you, Chris. Always insightful and engaging. Appreciate that presentation. There were a couple of questions that came in while you were speaking. The first was a request for the link to the Forrester article that you were referencing. It looks like that was located on your pathfactory.com website. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you go to pathfactory.com, you'll see it just scrolling down from the hero banner, but we can also include that in our follow-up email so you can get it that way too.
Perfect. The other question that came in here is also for you. It says, so does this mean less dependencies on forms and focus on cookies?
It's a very good question. I think we're going to have to. I mean, there's also this movement going towards ungating. And, you know, I'm a demand generation marketer. I do need to generate leads for my sales team. So I won't say that I never use a form. I think it's about appropriate use of forms. But absolutely, we will reduce our dependency on forms when we can actually walk buyers through content in sequence and in series. So where there's a time and a place for a form, and our platform can accommodate forms in various different ways, I think we will be reducing our dependency on forms.
Great. There were some additional questions that were submitted here as well. Mark, this one is for you. You mentioned some other GDPR marketing techniques in the last webinar. Would you mind refreshing our memory as to what they were?
Sure. It probably would be best to go to the last webinar to cover them because I can't cover them fully. One is to make them a low-cost customer. That means, you know, when you have a contractual relationship with a with somebody, you have a stronger, you have a contractual basis for processing as per the 3 types that we were talking about before. And so if you can find something small to sell them, for example, we had a company, I know of a company that makes airplanes and jets. And they started selling on their website 2 things. They started selling Bose pilot headsets, which are normally like $500 or $600. They started selling them to qualified people for $100, which was a terrific deal. And the company was perfectly happy to pay $300 or $400 per highly qualified airplane purchasing lead. They also sold some mini versions of that actually flew, models. RC models, radio control models, and also again did it on a very, very price aggressive basis. So it was highly targeted to their audience. But when they were done, they had contracts, purchase contracts, not obviously buying a full blown jet or plane or anything. But since they had contracts with their customers, they were able to market to them on an ongoing basis, so a little more freely. Another was to leverage the pre-existing consent that comes with social media. When you work through LinkedIn, and I'm not talking about the paid approach, that's possible too, of course, but when you work through Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, you have effectively some pre-existing consent between those companies and the end EU citizens. Now, that may not last forever, or those companies may work to shut that down in some way, shape, or form over time. But right now, it is a legal way to work around the lack of consent issue for a particular individual or a set of individuals. And I think that's there was a lot more in that last webinar, but that's a couple of the key items.
Great, thank you, Mark. Chris, there was a question that was submitted here for you. When you use PathFactory, how much flexibility is there in the platform for GDPR compliance?
Yeah. So I alluded to it a little bit during the webinar, but we've spent a lot of time on this. We have certainly a lot of multinational companies that focus on Europe, and so this was absolutely on their radar from day one. And we've been working on it for the better part of this year, just tweaking it and getting it just right for every customer use case. So we have a huge amount of flexibility. Of course, you can customize the text that comes up on a cookie consent dialog box. You can present any form that you need inside of our platform, including checkboxes to collect consent that can be unchecked by default. And then also the categorization of cookies so that people can actually understand what is being collected on an essential basis versus what they're opting into, categorizing all of that and making sure that those scripts that fire to collect cookies only fire in the right circumstances, and even down to the level of whether we capture any data, even on an anonymous basis on somebody's session or not, is something that you can configure in our platform. So I know that's a lot of technical detail, but we've certainly focused on it and accommodated really any scenario that we could conceive of, or any of our customers could conceive of.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Now, I'm not sure which one of you this is directed towards, but I'll just put it out there and you guys can decide. You'd mentioned a while back that you can't trade white papers for consent. Why not? Mark, maybe that was directed towards you.
Sure. So again, I touched on it in the webinar a little bit, but under GDPR, consent must be freely given. You can't trade for it. You can't exchange something for it. You can't bargain with it or for it. You can't bribe somebody for it. In many ways, you could argue, hey, what about my rights? But it's kind of like saying you can't sell yourself into slavery. The idea is that freedom is a basic human right, and the ability to consent to marketing, or the ability to have privacy, I should say, is a basic human right. That's the EU's position. And so you can't sell yourself into slavery. You can't sell your data to these companies. You can give it away to these companies. The whole world that we have lived in, where you normally trade a high value asset, as far as the EU is concerned, it is off the table. You have to have people want to give you marketing consent because they actually want the stuff.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Chris, it looks like this is one of our last questions here. The question is, do B2B buyers actually binge on content from what you're seeing?
Yeah, we used to get that question a lot in the earlier days of the organization, and it was one of the first hypotheses that we tried to prove as a company. Fundamentally, that in people's B2C lives, of course, they binge consume. They binge watch on Netflix, on YouTube, all the different services that I mentioned. So in their personal lives, they're used to binge consumption. But the question was, would they do it in their B2B lives? And so we tested that very early on in the company's history, and we found, lo and behold, they totally do. Our average for a long time across our customer base, I think this is still in the ballpark, is that around 30% of people will actually consume 2 or more sessions when presented with a content track. So as long as they're presented more options in session, as long as they're presented with another option as they're viewing that first piece of content, they will typically move on to another piece of content, on average 30% of the time. Sometimes it can be a little lower, a little bit higher, depending on a myriad of different variables. But it absolutely does happen. And it's funny, it happens all over the place. It happens in technology, with companies that focus on engineering, logistics and supply chain. It doesn't really matter what industry you're in. When somebody is looking to make a purchase, they will binge consume your content.
Great. One last question came in here. Mark, you'd referenced earlier that one of your contacts or accounts was implementing CASL and GDPR. Do you guys handle multiple laws beyond GDPR with your solution?
So we have a brand new product called 4Comply that is a platform for multiple instantiations of law. It's really a new version of our release of our product, and it was designed for just that purpose and has very recently come out. So yes, absolutely. We don't have laws beyond GDPR and CASL implemented in it or set up in it right now, but the underlying architecture is now rewritten so we can support basically any laws that come along.
Great. And we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to conclude today's webinar. If any of you are interested in more information regarding 4Thought Marketing's GDPR consulting, cloud apps, or our new 4Comply product that Mark was just referencing there, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is up on the screen. Feel free to call or email me. Also, if you're interested in Path Factories and their ability to deliver dynamic multi-part assets, that let your customers binge on content despite GDPR, please feel free to email Chris. They're at marketing@pathfactory.com, or visit the website for access to that Forrester report. And with that, thank you, panelists, and thank you everyone who attended. We will send out a copy of the recording here within the next day or so that you can review it at your leisure. And please tune in next, actually December 13th, for the next installment of our GDPR series. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.